My grandfather was a Norwegian spy during World War II, and while that sounds pretty cool today, it had ripple effects on my family for decades after the war ended. Grandpa Andrew rarely talked about it. My dad, Gary, is one of the few people who heard his stories, but they were always missing bits of information and shifted over time. This always bothered him. So, we decided to take a trip to Norway to get some answers. I was excited for this trip. My dad's been talking about this for years and years. I don't know a lot about my grandpa, so I was very excited to go to Norway to learn more about him. But I think I was even more excited to learn about my dad and the impacts that what his dad went through had on his life. So I was very eager and very excited to go on this trip with him. My grandpa was born Sverre Andreas Isaksen in 1912 in Oslo, Norway. His mom was too poor to care for him, so when he was 13, he was adopted by a Saskatchewan farm couple and became Andrew Anderson. Years later, he returned to Norway with his young family. Then war broke out, and Norway was occupied by German forces. Before our trip, we knew Grandpa gathered intelligence on German forces as a member of the Norwegian resistance movement. Grandpa had told my dad that he went on a reconnaissance trip to a city in Norway's far north called Narvik to take photos of German U-boat installations. He then hid the roll of film inside a sink faucet on a train to Sweden. An Allied spy retrieved the film there and delivered it to England. He also kept a roll of personal photos from this mission, which he only had developed years later. We decided to follow in Grandpa's tracks. We boarded a train that runs that same route. Taking the train from Narvik to Sweden was a really special moment and kind of put things into perspective a little bit. I'm a few years older than what my grandpa was when he was on that very same train line, and I was certainly not doing things like that when I was in my 30s. And so to be in that spot, in this really remote part of the world, learning about what Grandpa did and to be on that train line was overwhelming in ways, and just really proud of what my grandpa did during the war. We don't know how many secret missions Grandpa carried out, but we know he eventually got caught. We found his arrest record at Norway's Resistance Museum in Oslo. It shows the Gestapo arrested Grandpa in September 1944. He was a prisoner at the Gestapo headquarters in Oslo for more than 3 months. He was interrogated and beaten. Then he was moved to a nearby prison camp. It wasn't a concentration camp, but the conditions were inhumane. Greenie Prison Camp is now a museum that paints a grim picture of what life was like there. During our visit, we were told that prisoners lived in constant fear of being deported to concentration camps in Germany. That hit me hard. The Second World War ended on May 8, 1945.
Yesterday morning at 2:41 a.m.,
Grandpa walked out of Greenie 3 days later. But it's clear to me now that Grandpa never fully escaped his experience there. Grandpa and his family returned to Saskatchewan in 1947. That's where my dad was born. His father's mental health deteriorated, and by the time my dad was 15, he had to hide the guns in the house. Eventually, RCMP officers took Grandpa to the psychiatric ward in Saskatoon, where he stayed for 6 weeks. Doctors said he experienced a nervous breakdown. He was diagnosed with severe depression and acute paranoia. As the years went by, the diagnosis changed to schizophrenia. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't a recognized mental illness at that time. Grandpa was placed on medications that my dad said made him a shell of his former self. When I think about the impact of my grandpa's trauma, the impact that it had on my dad, I feel so sorry for my dad. I don't think anyone should have to experience witnessing their father, their parent, go through something like that, let alone at the age of 15, and with mental health supports kind of lacking in small town Saskatchewan at that time. You know, my dad didn't really have a lot of people to talk about that with. So yeah, that was really hard to hear, and my dad had never really opened up about that until we were on this trip, and he shared some stories. And so yeah, just a lot of sympathy for my dad, because he went through a lot as a young kid. I was 5 years old when my grandpa passed away in 1987. I never had the chance to tell him that there is no shame in going through mental health struggles. I'll certainly be telling my dad that.